Cold War. The whole story, narrated straight from Wikipedia, start to finish. Let's dive in. The Cold War was a period of international geopolitical rivalry between the United States, US, and the Soviet Union, USSR, and their respective allies, the capitalist Western Bloc and Communist Eastern Bloc. It began in the aftermath of the Second World War and ended with the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. The term Cold War is used because there was no direct fighting between the two superpowers, though each supported opposing sides in regional conflicts known as proxy wars. In addition to the struggle for ideological and economic influence and an arms race in both conventional and nuclear weapons, the Cold War was expressed through technological rivalries such as the space race, espionage, propaganda campaigns, embargoes, and sports diplomacy. After the end of the Second World War in 1945, during which the US and USSR had been allies, the USSR installed satellite governments in its occupied territories in Eastern Europe and North Korea by 1949, resulting in the political division of Europe and Germany by an Iron Curtain. The USSR tested its first nuclear weapon in 1949, 4 years after their use by the US on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and allied with the People's Republic of China, founded in 1949. The US declared the Truman Doctrine of Containment of Communism in 1947, launched the Marshall Plan in 1948, to assist Western Europe's economic recovery, and founded the NATO military alliance in 1949, matched by the Soviet-led Warsaw Pact in 1955. The Berlin Blockade of 1948 to 1949 was an early confrontation, as was the Korean War of 1950 to 1953, which ended in a stalemate. U.S. involvement in regime change during the Cold War included support for First World anti-communist and right-wing dictatorships and uprisings, while Soviet involvement included the funding of Second World left-wing parties, wars of independence, and dictatorships. As nearly all the colonial states underwent decolonization, many became Third World battlefields of the Cold War. Both powers used economic aid in an attempt to win the loyalty of non-aligned countries. The Cuban Revolution of 1959 installed the first communist regime in the Western Hemisphere, and in 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis began after deployments of U.S. missiles in Europe and Soviet missiles in Cuba. It is widely considered the closest the Cold War came to escalating into nuclear war. Another major proxy conflict was the Vietnam War of 1955 to 1975, which ended in defeat for the US. The USSR solidified its domination of Eastern Europe with its crushing of the Hungarian Revolution in 1956 and the Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. Relations between the USSR and China broke down by 1961, with the Sino-Soviet split bringing the two states to the brink of war amid a border conflict in 1969. In 1972, the U.S. initiated diplomatic contacts with China, and the U.S. and USSR signed a series of treaties limiting their nuclear arsenals during a period known as détente. In 1979, the toppling of U.S. allied governments in Iran and Nicaragua and the outbreak of the Soviet-Afghan War again raised tensions. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became leader of the USSR and expanded political freedoms, which contributed to the revolutions of 1989 in the Eastern Bloc and the collapse of the USSR in 1991, ending the Cold War. Terminology. Writer George Orwell used Cold War as a general term in his essay You and the Atomic Bomb, published 19th of October, 1945. Contemplating a world living in the shadow of the threat of nuclear warfare, Orwell looked at James Burnham's predictions of a polarized world, writing, "Looking at the world as a whole, the drift for many decades has been not towards anarchy, but towards the reimposition of slavery. James Burnham's theory has been much discussed, but few people have yet considered its ideological implications. That is, the kind of worldview, the kind of beliefs, and the social structure that would probably prevail in a state which was at once unconquerable and in a permanent state of Cold War with its neighbors. In The Observer of 10th March 1946, Orwell wrote, "After the Moscow Conference last December, Russia began to make a Cold War on Britain and the British Empire. The first use of the term to describe the specific post-war geopolitical confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States came in a speech by Bernard Baruch, an influential advisor to Democratic presidents, on 16th of April 1947. The speech, written by journalist Herbert Bayard Swope, proclaimed, 'We are today in the midst of a Cold War.' Newspaper columnist Walter Lippmann gave the term wide currency with his book, The Cold War. When asked in 1947 about the source of the term, Lippmann traced it to a French term from the 1930s, La guerre froide, background and periodization. The United States and its Western European allies sought to strengthen their bonds and used the policy of containment against Soviet influence. They accomplished this most notably through the formation of NATO, which was essentially a defensive agreement in 1949. The Soviet Union countered with the Warsaw Pact in 1955, which had similar results with the Eastern Bloc, as by that time the Soviet Union already had an armed presence and political domination all over its eastern satellite states. The pact has been long considered superfluous. Although nominally a defensive alliance, the Warsaw Pact's primary function was to safeguard Soviet hegemony over its Eastern European satellites, with the Pact's only direct military actions having been the invasions of its own member states to keep them from breaking away. In the 1960s, the Pact evolved into a multilateral alliance, in which the non-Soviet Warsaw Pact members gained significant scope to pursue their own interests. In 1961, Soviet-allied East Germany constructed the Berlin Wall to prevent the citizens of East Berlin from fleeing to West Berlin, at the time part of United States-allied West Germany. In 1991, the Russian Federation became the Soviet Union's successor state, while many of the other republics emerged as fully independent post-Soviet states. Containment, Truman Doctrine, Korean War, 1947-1953. Iron Curtain, Iran, Turkey, Greece, and Poland. In February 1946, George F. Kennan's long telegram from Moscow to Washington helped to articulate the U.S. government's increasingly hard line against the Soviets, which would become the basis for U.S. strategy toward the Soviet Union. The telegram galvanized a policy debate that would eventually shape the Truman administration's Soviet policy. Washington's opposition to the Soviets accumulated after broken promises by Stalin and Molotov concerning Europe and Iran. Following the World War II Anglo-Soviet invasion of Iran, the country was occupied by the Red Army in the far north and the British in the south. Iran was used by the United States and British to supply the Soviet Union, and the Allies agreed to withdraw from Iran within 6 months after the cessation of hostilities. However, when this deadline came, the Soviets remained in Iran under the guise of the Azerbaijan People's Government and Kurdish Republic of Mahabad. On 5th March, former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill delivered his famous Iron Curtain speech, Fulton's Speech, calling for an Anglo-American alliance against the Soviets, whom he accused of establishing an Iron Curtain dividing Europe. A week later, on 13th of March, Stalin responded vigorously to the speech, saying Churchill could be compared to Adolf Hitler insofar as he advocated the racial superiority of English-speaking nations so that they could satisfy their hunger for world domination, and that such a declaration was a call for war on the USSR. The Soviet leader also dismissed the accusation that the USSR was exerting increasing control over the countries lying in its sphere. He argued that there was nothing surprising in the fact that the Soviet Union, anxious for its future safety, was trying to see to it that governments loyal in their attitude to the Soviet Union should exist in these countries. Soviet territorial demands to Turkey regarding the Dardanelles in the Turkish Straits crisis and Black Sea border disputes were also a major factor in increasing tensions. In September, the Soviet side produced the Novikov telegram, sent by the Soviet ambassador to the US, but commissioned and co-authored by Vyacheslav Molotov. It portrayed the US as being in the grip of monopoly capitalists who were building up military capability to prepare the conditions for winning world supremacy in a new war. On 6th September 1946, James F. Burns delivered a speech in Germany repudiating the Morgenthau Plan, a proposal to partition and deindustrialize post-war Germany, and warning the Soviets that the US intended to maintain a military presence in Europe indefinitely. As Burns stated a month later, the nub of our program was to win the German people. It was a battle between us and Russia over mines. In December, the Soviets agreed to withdraw from Iran after persistent US pressure, an early success of containment policy. By 1947, US President Harry S. Truman was outraged by the perceived resistance of the Soviet Union to American demands in Iran, Turkey, and Greece, as well as Soviet rejection of the Baruch Plan on nuclear weapons. In February 1947, the British government announced that it could no longer afford to finance the Kingdom of Greece against the communist-led DSE in the Greek Civil War. In the same month, Stalin conducted the rigged 1947 Polish legislative election, which constituted an open breach of the Yalta Agreement. The US government responded by adopting a policy of containment with the goal of stopping the spread of communism. Truman delivered a speech calling for the allocation of $400 million to intervene in the war, and unveiled the Truman Doctrine, which framed the conflict as a contest between free peoples and totalitarian regimes. American policymakers accused the Soviet Union of conspiring against the Greek royalists in an effort to expand Soviet influence, even though Stalin had told the Communist Party to cooperate with the British-backed government. Enunciation of the Truman Doctrine marked the beginning of a U.S. bipartisan defense and foreign policy consensus between Republicans and Democrats focused on containment and deterrence that weakened during and after the Vietnam War, but ultimately persisted thereafter. Moderate and conservative parties in Europe, as well as Social Democrats, gave virtually unconditional support to the Western Alliance, while European and American communists, financed by the KGB and involved in its intelligence operations, adhered to Moscow's line, although dissent began to appear after 1956. Other critiques of the consensus policy came from anti-Vietnam War activists, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, and the anti-nuclear movement, Marshall Plan, Czechoslovak coup, and formation of two German states. In early 1947, France, Britain, and the United States unsuccessfully attempted to reach an agreement with the Soviet Union for a plan envisioning an economically self-sufficient Germany, including a detailed accounting of the industrial plants, goods, and infrastructure already taken by the Soviets. In June 1947, in accordance with the Truman Doctrine, the United States enacted the Marshall Plan, a pledge of economic assistance for all European countries willing to participate. Under the plan, which President Harry S. Truman signed on 3 April 1948, the U.S. government gave to Western European countries over $13 billion, equivalent to $189 billion in 2016. Later, the program led to the creation of the OECD. The plan's aim was to rebuild the democratic and economic systems of Europe and to counter perceived threats to the European balance of power, such as communist parties seizing control. The plan also stated that European prosperity was contingent upon German economic recovery. 1 month later, Truman signed the National Security Act of 1947, creating a unified Department of Defense, the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, and the National Security Council, NSC. These would become the main bureaucracies for U.S. defense policy in the Cold War. Stalin believed economic integration with the West would allow Eastern Bloc countries to escape Soviet control, and that the U.S. was trying to buy a pro-U.S. realignment of Europe. Stalin therefore prevented Eastern Bloc nations from receiving Marshall Plan aid. The Soviet Union's alternative to the Marshall Plan, which was purported to involve Soviet subsidies and trade with Central and Eastern Europe, became known as the Molotov Plan, later institutionalized in January 1949 as the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance. Stalin was also fearful of a reconstituted Germany. His vision of a post-war Germany did not include the ability to rearm or pose any kind of threat to the Soviet Union. In early 1948, Czech communists executed a coup d'etat in Czechoslovakia, resulting in the formation of the Czechoslovak Socialist Republic, the only Eastern Bloc state that the Soviets had permitted to retain democratic structures. The public brutality of the coup shocked Western powers more than any event up to that point, and swept away the last vestiges of opposition to the Marshall Plan in the United States Congress. In an immediate aftermath of the crisis, the London Six Power Conference was held, resulting in the Soviet boycott of the Allied Control Council and its incapacitation, an event marking the beginning of the full-blown Cold War, as well as ending any hopes at the time for a single German government and leading to formation in 1949 of the Federal Republic of Germany and German Democratic Republic. The twin policies of the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan led to billions in economic and military aid for Western Europe, Greece, and Turkey. With the U.S. assistance, the Greek military won its civil war. Under the leadership of Alcide de Gasperi, the Italian Christian Democrats defeated the powerful Communist Socialist Alliance in the elections of 1948. Outside of Europe, the United States also began to express interest in the development of many other countries, so that they would not fall under the sway of Eastern Bloc communism. In his January 1949 inaugural address, Truman declared for the first time in U.S. history that international development would be a key part of U.S. foreign policy. The resulting program later became known as the Point 4 program because it was the fourth point raised in his address: espionage. All major powers engaged in espionage, using a great variety of spies, double agents, moles, and new technologies such as the tapping of telephone cables. The Soviet KGB, Committee for State Security, the bureau responsible for foreign espionage and internal surveillance, was famous for its effectiveness. The most famous Soviet operation involved its atomic spies that delivered crucial information from the United States Manhattan Project, leading the USSR to detonate its first nuclear weapon in 1949, 4 years after the American detonation and much sooner than expected. A massive network of informants throughout the Soviet Union was used to monitor dissent from official Soviet politics and morals. Although to an extent disinformation had always existed, the term itself was invented, and the strategy formalized by a black propaganda department of the Soviet KGB. Based on the amount of top-secret Cold War archival information that has been released, historian Raymond L. Garthoff concludes there probably was parity in the quantity and quality of secret information obtained by each side. However, the Soviets probably had an advantage in terms of human intelligence or interpersonal espionage, and sometimes in its reach into high policy circles. In terms of decisive impact, however, he concludes, "We also can now have high confidence in the judgment that there were no successful moles at the political decision-making level on either side. Similarly, there is no evidence on either side of any major political or military decision that was prematurely discovered through espionage and thwarted by the other side. There also is no evidence of any major political or military decision that was crucially influenced, much less generated, by an agent of the other side." According to historian Robert L. Benson, Washington's forte was signals, intelligence, the procurement and analysis of coded foreign messages, leading to the Venona Project or Venona Intercepts, which monitored the communications of Soviet intelligence agents. Moynihan wrote that the Venona Project contained overwhelming proof of the activities of Soviet spy networks in America, complete with names, dates, places, and deeds. The Venona Project was kept highly secret, even from policymakers, until the Moynihan Commission in 1995. Despite this, the decryption project had already been betrayed and dispatched to the USSR by Kim Philby and Bill Weisband in 1946, as was discovered by the US by 1950. Nonetheless, the Soviets had to keep their discovery of the program secret too, and continued leaking their own information, some of which was still useful to the American program. According to Moynihan, even President Truman may not have been fully informed of Venona, which may have left him unaware of the extent of Soviet espionage. Clandestine atomic spies from the Soviet Union, who infiltrated the Manhattan Project during Debütanter, played a major role in increasing tensions that led to the Cold War. In addition to usual espionage, the Western agencies paid special attention to debriefing Eastern Bloc defectors. Edward J. Epstein describes that the CIA understood that the KGB used provocations, or fake defections, as a trick to embarrass Western intelligence and establish Soviet double agents. As a result, from 1959 to 1973, the CIA required that East Bloc defectors went through a counterintelligence investigation before being recruited as a source of intelligence. During the late 1970s and 1980s, the KGB perfected its use of espionage to sway and distort diplomacy. Active measures were clandestine operations designed to further Soviet foreign policy goals, consisting of disinformation, forgeries, leaks to foreign media, and the channeling of aid to militant groups. Retired KGB Major General Oleg Kalugin described active measures as the heart and soul of Soviet intelligence. During the Sino-Soviet split, spy wars also occurred between the USSR and PRC, Cominform, and the Tito-Stalin split. In September 1947, the Soviets created Cominform to impose orthodoxy within the international communist movement and tighten political control over Soviet satellites through coordination of communist parties in the Eastern Bloc. Cominform faced an embarrassing setback the following June when the Tito-Stalin split obliged its members to expel Yugoslavia, which remained communist but adopted a non-aligned position and began accepting financial aid from the US. Besides Berlin, the status of the city of Trieste was at issue. Until the break between Tito and Stalin, the Western powers and the Eastern Bloc faced each other uncompromisingly. In addition to capitalism and communism, Italians and Slovenes, monarchists and republicans, as well as war winners and losers, often faced each other irreconcilably. The neutral buffer state, Free Territory of Trieste, founded in 1947 with the United Nations, was split up and dissolved in 1954 and 1975, also because of the détente between the West and Tito, Berlin Blockade. The US and Britain merged their Western German occupation zones into Bizone, 1st January 1947, later Trizone, with the addition of France's zone, April 1949. As part of the economic rebuilding of Germany in early 1948, representatives of a number of Western European governments and the United States announced an agreement for a merger of Western German areas into a federal governmental system. In addition, in accordance with the Marshall Plan, they began to reindustrialize and rebuild the West German economy, including the introduction of a new Deutsche Mark currency to replace the old Reichsmark currency that the Soviets had debased. The US had secretly decided that a unified and neutral Germany was undesirable, with Walter Bedell Smith telling General Eisenhower, "In spite of our announced position, we really do not want nor intend to accept German unification on any terms that the Russians might agree to, even though they seem to meet most of our requirements." Shortly thereafter, Stalin instituted the Berlin Blockade, June 1948, May 1949, one of the first major crises of the Cold War, preventing Western supplies from reaching West Germany's enclave of West Berlin. The United States, primarily Britain, France, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and several other countries, began the massive Berlin Airlift, supplying West Berlin with provisions despite Soviet threats. The Soviets mounted a public relations campaign against the policy change. Once again, the East Berlin Communists attempted to disrupt the Berlin municipal elections, which were held on 5th of December 1948 and produced a turnout of 86% and an overwhelming victory for the non-communist parties. The results effectively divided the city into East and West, the latter comprising US, British, and French sectors. 300,000 Berliners demonstrated and urged the international airlift to continue, and US Air Force pilot Gail Halvorsen created Operation Vittles, which supplied candy to German children. The airlift was as much a logistical as a political and psychological success for the West. It firmly linked West Berlin to the United States. In May 1949, Stalin lifted the blockade. In 1952, Stalin repeatedly proposed a plan to unify East and West Germany under a single government chosen in elections supervised by the United Nations, if the new Germany were to stay out of Western military alliances, but this proposal was turned down by the Western powers. Some sources dispute the sincerity of the proposal. Beginnings of NATO and Radio Free Europe, Britain, France, the United States, Canada, and 8 other Western European countries signed the North Atlantic Treaty of April 1949, establishing the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. That August, the first Soviet atomic device was detonated in Semipalatinsk, Kazakh SSR. Following Soviet refusals to participate in a German rebuilding effort set forth by Western European countries in 1948, the US, Britain, and France spearheaded the establishment of the Federal Republic of Germany from the 3 Western zones of occupation in April 1949. The Soviet Union proclaimed its zone of occupation in Germany, the German Democratic Republic, that October. Media in the Eastern Bloc was an organ of the state, completely reliant on and subservient to the Communist Party. Radio and television organizations were state-owned, while print media was usually owned by political organizations, mostly by the local Communist Party. Soviet radio broadcasts used Marxist rhetoric to attack capitalism, emphasizing themes of labor exploitation, imperialism, and warmongering. Along with the broadcasts of the BBC and the Voice of America to Central and Eastern Europe, a major propaganda effort began in 1949, was Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, dedicated to bringing about the peaceful demise of the communist system in the Eastern Bloc. Radio Free Europe attempted to achieve these goals by serving as a surrogate home radio station, an alternative to the controlled and party-dominated domestic press in the Soviet bloc. Radio Free Europe was a product of some of the most prominent architects of America's early Cold War strategy, especially those who believed that the Cold War would eventually be fought by political rather than military means, such as George F. Kennan. Soviet and Eastern Bloc authorities used various methods to suppress Western broadcasts, including radio jamming. American policymakers, including Kennan and John Foster Dulles, acknowledged that the Cold War was in its essence a war of ideas. The United States, acting through the CIA, funded a long list of projects to counter the communist appeal among intellectuals in Europe and the developing world. The CIA also covertly sponsored a domestic propaganda campaign called Crusade for Freedom, German rearmament. The rearmament of West Germany was achieved in the early 1950s. Its main promoter was Konrad Adenauer, the Chancellor of West Germany, with France the main opponent. Washington had the decisive voice. It was strongly supported by the Pentagon, the U.S. military leadership, and weakly opposed by President Truman. The State Department was ambivalent. The outbreak of the Korean War in June 1950 changed the calculations, and Washington now gave full support. That also involved naming Dwight D. Eisenhower in charge of NATO forces and sending more American troops to West Germany. There was a strong promise that West Germany would not develop nuclear weapons. Widespread fears of another rise of German militarism necessitated the new military to operate within an alliance framework under NATO command. In 1955, Washington secured full German membership of NATO. In May 1953, Lavrenti Beria, by then in a government post, had made an unsuccessful proposal to allow the reunification of a neutral Germany to prevent West Germany's incorporation into NATO. But his attempts were cut short after he was executed several months later during a Soviet power struggle. The events led to the establishment of the Bundeswehr, the West German military, in 1955. Chinese Civil War, SEATO, and NSC 68. In 1949, Mao Zedong's People's Liberation Army defeated Chiang Kai-shek's United States-backed Kuomintang, KMT, nationalist government in China. The KMT-controlled territory was now restricted to the island of Taiwan, the nationalist government of which exists to this day. The Kremlin promptly created an alliance with the newly formed People's Republic of China. According to Norwegian historian Odd Arne Westad, the communists won the Civil War because they made fewer military mistakes than Chiang Kai-shek made, and because in his search for a powerful, centralized government, Chiang antagonized too many interest groups in China. Moreover, his party was weakened during the war against Japan. Meanwhile, the communists told different groups, such as the peasants, exactly what they wanted to hear, and they cloaked themselves under the cover of Chinese nationalism. Confronted with the communist revolution in China and the end of the American atomic monopoly in 1949, the Truman administration quickly moved to escalate and expand its containment doctrine. In NSC 68, a secret 1950 document, the National Security Council proposed reinforcing pro-Western alliance systems and quadrupling spending on defense. Truman, under the influence of advisor Paul Nitze, saw containment as implying complete rollback of Soviet influence in all its forms. United States officials moved to expand this version of containment into Asia, Africa, and Latin America in order to counter revolutionary nationalist movements, often led by communist parties financed by the USSR. In this way, this US would exercise preponderant power, oppose neutrality, and establish global hegemony. In the early 1950s, a period sometimes known as the Pactomania, the US formalized a series of alliances with Japan, a former WW enemy, South Korea, Taiwan, Australia, New Zealand, Thailand, and the Philippines, notably AUNZUS in 1951 and SEATO in 1954, thereby guaranteeing the United States a number of long-term military bases. Korean War. One of the more significant examples of the implementation of containment was the United Nations US-led intervention in the Korean War. In June 1950, after years of mutual hostilities, Kim Il-sung's North Korean People's Army invaded South Korea. Stalin had been reluctant to support the invasion, but ultimately sent advisors. To Stalin's surprise, the United Nations Security Council backed the defense of South Korea, although the Soviets were then boycotting meetings in protest of the fact that Taiwan, Republic of China, not the People's Republic of China, held a permanent seat on the council. A UN force of 16 countries faced North Korea, although 40% of troops were South Korean, and about 50% were from the United States. The US initially seemed to follow containment, only pushing back North Korea across the 38th parallel and restoring South Korea's sovereignty while allowing North Korea's survival as a state. However, the success of the Incheon landing inspired the US UN forces to pursue a rollback strategy instead and to overthrow communist North Korea, thereby allowing nationwide elections under UN auspices. General Douglas MacArthur then advanced into North Korea. The Chinese, fearful of a possible US invasion, sent in a large army and pushed the UN forces back below the 38th parallel. The episode was used to support the wisdom of the Containment Doctrine as opposed to rollback. The communists were later pushed to roughly around the original border with minimal changes. Among other effects, the Korean War galvanized NATO to develop a military structure. The Korean Armistice Agreement was approved in July 1953. Nuclear arms race and escalation, 1953-1962. Khrushchev, Eisenhower, and de-Stalinization. In 1953, changes in political leadership on both sides shifted the dynamic of the Cold War. Dwight D. Eisenhower was inaugurated president that January. During the last 18 months of the Truman administration, the American defense budget had quadrupled, and Eisenhower moved to reduce military spending by a third, while continuing to fight the Cold War effectively. Joseph Stalin died in 1953. Nikita Khrushchev eventually won the ensuing power struggle by the mid-1950s. In 1956, he denounced Joseph Stalin and proceeded to ease controls over the party and society, de-Stalinization. On 18th of November 1956, while addressing Western dignitaries at a reception in Moscow's Polish embassy, Khrushchev infamously declared, "Whether you like it or not, history is on our side. We will bury you," shocking everyone present. He would later claim he had not been referring to nuclear war, but the historically fated victory of communism over capitalism. Eisenhower's Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, initiated a new look for the containment strategy, calling for a greater reliance on nuclear weapons against U.S. enemies in wartime. Dulles also enunciated the doctrine of massive retaliation, threatening a severe U.S. response to any Soviet aggression. Possessing nuclear superiority, for example, allowed Eisenhower to face down Soviet threats to intervene in the Middle East during the 1956 Suez Crisis. The declassified U.S. plans for retaliatory nuclear strikes in the late 1950s included the systematic destruction of 1,200 major urban centers in the Soviet bloc and China, including Moscow, East Berlin, and Beijing. In spite of these events, there were substantial hopes for détente when an upswing in diplomacy took place in 1959, including a 2-week visit by Khrushchev to the U.S. and plans for a two-power summit for May 1960. The latter was disturbed by the U-2 spy plane scandal, however, in which Eisenhower was caught lying about the intrusion of American surveillance aircraft into Soviet territory, Warsaw Pact, and Hungarian Revolution. While Stalin's death in 1953 slightly relaxed tensions, the situation in Europe remained an uneasy armed truce. The Soviets, who had already created a network of mutual assistance treaties in the Eastern Bloc by 1949, established a formal alliance therein, the Warsaw Pact, in 1955. It stood opposed to NATO. The Hungarian Revolution of 1956 occurred shortly after Khrushchev arranged the removal of Hungary's Stalinist leader, Matyas Rákosi. In response to a popular anti-communist uprising, the new regime formally disbanded the secret police, declared its intention to withdraw from the Warsaw Pact, and pledged to re-establish free elections. The Soviet army invaded. Thousands of Hungarians were killed and arrested, imprisoned, and deported to the Soviet Union, and approximately 200,000 Hungarians fled Hungary. Hungarian leader Imre Nagy and others were executed following secret trials. From 1957 through 1961, Khrushchev openly and repeatedly threatened the West with nuclear annihilation. He claimed that Soviet missile capabilities were far superior to those of the United States, capable of wiping out any American or European city. According to John Lewis Gaddis, Khrushchev rejected Stalin's belief in the inevitability of war. However, the new leader declared his ultimate goal was peaceful coexistence. In Khrushchev's formulation, peace would allow capitalism to collapse on its own, as well as giving the Soviets time to boost their military capabilities, which remained for decades until Gorbachev's later New Thinking, envisioning peaceful coexistence as an end in itself rather than a form of class struggle. The events in Hungary produced ideological fractures within the communist parties of the world, particularly in Western Europe, with great decline in membership, as many in both Western and socialist countries felt disillusioned by the brutal Soviet response. The communist parties in the West would never recover. Rapacki Plan and Berlin Crisis of 1958-1959. In 1957, Polish Foreign Minister Adam Rapacki proposed the Rapacki Plan for a nuclear-free zone in Central Europe. Public opinion tended to be favorable in the West, but it was rejected by leaders of West Germany, Britain, France, and the United States. They feared it would leave the powerful conventional armies of the Warsaw Pact dominant over the weaker NATO armies. During November 1958, Khrushchev made an unsuccessful attempt to turn all of Berlin into an independent, demilitarized, free city. He gave the United States, Great Britain, and France a 6-month ultimatum to withdraw their troops from the sectors of West Berlin, or he would transfer control of Western access rights to the East Germans. Khrushchev earlier explained to Mao Zedong that Berlin is the testicles of the West. Every time I want to make the West scream, I squeeze on Berlin. NATO formally rejected the ultimatum in mid-December, and Khrushchev withdrew it in return for a Geneva conference on the German question, American military buildup. Like Truman and Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy supported containment. President Eisenhower's New Look policy had emphasized the use of less expensive nuclear weapons to deter Soviet aggression by threatening massive nuclear attacks on all of the Soviet Union. Nuclear weapons were much cheaper than maintaining a large standing army, so Eisenhower cut conventional forces to save money. Kennedy implemented a new strategy known as flexible response. This strategy relied on conventional arms to achieve limited goals. As part of this policy, Kennedy expanded the United States Special Operations Forces, elite military units that could fight unconventionally in various conflicts. Kennedy hoped that the flexible response strategy would allow the U.S. to counter Soviet influence without resorting to nuclear war. To support his new strategy, Kennedy ordered a massive increase in defense spending and a rapid buildup of the nuclear arsenal to restore the lost superiority over the Soviet Union. In his inaugural address, Kennedy promised to bear any burden in the defense of liberty, and he repeatedly asked for increases in military spending and authorization of new weapon systems. From 1961 to 1964, the number of nuclear weapons increased by 50%, as did the number of B-52 bombers to deliver them. The new ICBM force grew from 63 intercontinental ballistic missiles to 424. He authorized 23 new Polaris submarines, each of which carried 16 nuclear missiles. Kennedy also called on cities to construct fallout shelters, competition in the Third World, Nationalist movements in some countries and regions, notably Guatemala, Indonesia, and Indochina, were often allied with communist groups or otherwise perceived to be unfriendly to Western interests. In this context, the United States and the Soviet Union increasingly competed for influence by proxy in the Third World as decolonization gained momentum in the 1950s and early 1960s. Both sides were selling armaments to gain influence. The Kremlin saw continuing territorial losses by imperial powers as presaging the eventual victory of their ideology. The United States used the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, to undermine neutral or hostile Third World governments and to support allied ones. In 1953, President Eisenhower implemented Operation Ajax, a covert coup operation to overthrow the Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mosaddegh. The popularly elected Mosaddegh had been a Middle Eastern nemesis of Britain since nationalizing the British-owned Anglo-Iranian Oil Company in 1951. Winston Churchill told the United States that Mosaddegh was increasingly turning towards communist influence. The pro-Western Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, assumed control as an autocratic monarch. The Shah's policies included banning the Communist Tudeh Party of Iran and general suppression of political dissent by SAVAK, the Shah's domestic security and intelligence agency. In Guatemala, a banana republic, the 1954 Guatemalan coup d'etat ousted the left-wing president Jacobo Arbenz with material CIA support. The post-Arbenz government, a military junta headed by Carlos Castillo Armas, repealed a progressive land reform law, returned nationalized property belonging to the United Fruit Company, set up a National Committee of Defense Against Communism, and decreed a preventive penal law against communism at the request of the United States. The non-aligned Indonesian government of Sukarno was faced with a major threat to its legitimacy beginning in 1956, when several regional commanders began to demand autonomy from Jakarta. After mediation failed, Sukarno took action to remove the dissident commanders. In February 1958, dissident military commanders in Central Sumatra, Colonel Ahmad Hussein, and North Sulawesi, Colonel Vence Sumwal, declared the Revolutionary Government of the Republic of Indonesia Permesta movement aimed at overthrowing the Sukarno regime. They were joined by many civilian politicians from the Masyumi party, such as Syafruddin Prawiranegara, who were opposed to the growing influence of the Communist Parti Komunis Indonesia. Due to their anti-communist rhetoric, the rebels received arms, funding, and other covert aid from the CIA until Alan Lawrence Pope, an American pilot, was shot down after a bombing raid on government-held Ambon in April 1958. The central government responded by launching airborne and seaborne military invasions of rebel strongholds at Padang and Manado. By the end of 1958, the rebels were militarily defeated, and the last remaining rebel guerrilla bands surrendered by August 1961. In the Republic of the Congo, also known as Congo Leopoldville, newly independent from Belgium since June 1960, the Congo crisis erupted on 5 July, leading to the secession of the regions Katanga and South Kasai. CIA-backed President Joseph Kasavubu ordered the dismissal of the democratically elected Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba and the Lumumba cabinet in September over massacres by the armed forces during the invasion of South Kasai and for involving Soviets in the country. Later, the CIA-backed Colonel Mobutu Sese Seko quickly mobilized his forces to seize power through a military coup d'etat and worked with Western intelligence agencies to imprison Lumumba and hand him over to Katangan authorities, who executed him by firing squad. In British Guiana, the leftist People's Progressive Party, PPP, candidate Chedi Jagan won the position of chief minister in a colonially administered election in 1953, but was quickly forced to resign from power after Britain's suspension of the still-dependent nation's constitution. Embarrassed by the landslide electoral victory of Jagan's allegedly Marxist party, the British imprisoned the PPP's leadership and maneuvered the organization into a divisive rupture in 1955. Jagan again won the colonial elections in 1957 and 1961, despite Britain's shift to a reconsideration of its view of the left-wing Jagan as a Soviet-style communist at this time. The United States pressured the British to withhold Guyana's independence until an alternative to Jagan could be identified, supported, and brought into office. In Malaya, the British colonialists suppressed the communist anti-colonial rebellion. The Civil War and the colonial war in Vietnam became internationalized and intertwined with the global Cold War, when Communist China and the Soviet Union recognized the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, North Vietnam, while the United States and other Western Bloc countries recognized the state of Vietnam in 1950. Following the watershed defeat by the communist Viet Minh rebels at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, the French accepted a negotiated abandonment of their neo-colonial stake in Vietnam in 1954. On June 4th, France granted full sovereignty to the anti-communist state of Vietnam, an independent country within the French Union. At the Geneva Conference in July, peace accords were signed, but they ultimately resulted in Vietnam being divided at the 17th parallel north between the Communist Bloc Allied North Vietnam and the Western Bloc Allied South Vietnam. Between 1954 and 1961, Eisenhower's United States sent economic aid and military advisors to strengthen South Vietnam's government against communist efforts to destabilize it. China provided increased economic aid to North Vietnam in 1967 to 1968. Many emerging nations of Asia, Africa, and Latin America rejected the pressure to choose sides in the East-West competition. In 1955, at the Bandung Conference in Indonesia, dozens of Third World governments resolved to stay out of the Cold War. The consensus reached at Bandung culminated with the creation of the Belgrade-headquartered non-aligned movement in 1961. Meanwhile, Khrushchev broadened Moscow's policy to establish ties with India and other key neutral states. Independence movements in the Third World transformed the post-war order into a more pluralistic world of decolonized African and Middle Eastern nations, and of rising nationalism in Asia and Latin America. Sino-Soviet split. After 1956, the Sino-Soviet alliance began to break down. Mao had defended Stalin when Khrushchev criticized him in 1956 and treated the new Soviet leader as a superficial upstart, accusing him of having lost his revolutionary edge. For his part, Khrushchev, disturbed by Mao's glib attitude toward nuclear war, referred to the Chinese leader as a lunatic on a throne. After this, Khrushchev made many desperate attempts to reconstitute the Sino-Soviet alliance, but Mao considered it useless and denied any proposal. The Chinese-Soviet animosity spilled out in an intra-communist propaganda war. Further on, the Soviets focused on a bitter rivalry with Mao's China for leadership of the global communist movement. Historian Lawrence M. Luthi argues, the Sino-Soviet split was one of the key events of the Cold War, equal in importance to the construction of the Berlin Wall, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Second Vietnam War, and Sino-American rapprochement. The split helped to determine the framework for the Cold War period 1979 to 1985 in general, and influenced the course of the Second Vietnam War in particular, space race. On the nuclear weapons front, the United States and the Soviet Union pursued nuclear rearmament and developed long-range weapons with which they could strike the territory of the other. In August 1957, the Soviets successfully launched the world's first intercontinental ballistic missile, ICBM, and in October, they launched the first Earth satellite, Sputnik 1. This led to what became known as the Sputnik Crisis. The Central Intelligence Agency described the orbit of Sputnik 1 as a stupendous scientific achievement, and concluded that the USSR had likely perfected an intercontinental ballistic missile, ICBM, capable of reaching any desired target with accuracy. The launch of Sputnik inaugurated the space race. This led to a series of historic space exploration milestones, and most notably, the Apollo moon landings from 1969 by the United States, which astronaut Frank Borman later described as just a battle in the Cold War. The public's reaction in the Soviet Union was mixed. The Soviet government limited the release of information about the lunar landing, which affected the reaction. A portion of the populace did not give it any attention, and another portion was angered by it. A major Cold War element of the space race was satellite reconnaissance, as well as signals intelligence to gauge which aspects of the space programs had military capabilities. The Soviet Salyut program, conducted in the 1970s and 1980s, put a crewed space station in long-term orbit. Two of the successful installations to the station were covers for secret military Almaz reconnaissance stations, Salyut 3 and Salyut 5. During the whole duration of the Cold War, the US and the USSR represented the largest and dominant space powers of the world. Despite their fierce competition, both nations signed international space treaties in the 1960s, which would limit the militarization of space. The first research of anti-satellite weapon technology also came about during this period. Later, the US and USSR pursued some cooperation in space as part of détente, notably the Apollo-Soyuz orbital rendezvous and docking. Aftermath of the Cuban Revolution. In Cuba, the 26th of July movement, led by young revolutionaries Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, seized power in the Cuban Revolution on 1st of January 1959. Although Fidel Castro's first refused to categorize his new government as socialist and repeatedly denying being a communist, Castro appointed Marxists to senior government and military positions. Diplomatic relations between Cuba and the United States continued for some time after Batista's fall, but President Eisenhower deliberately left the capital to avoid meeting Castro during the latter's trip to Washington, D.C. in April, leaving Vice President Richard Nixon to conduct the meeting in his place. Cuba began negotiating for arms purchases from the Eastern Bloc in March 1960. The same month, Eisenhower gave approval to CIA plans and funding to overthrow Castro. In January 1961, just prior to leaving office, Eisenhower formally severed relations with the Cuban government. That April, the administration of newly elected American President John F. Kennedy mounted the unsuccessful CIA-organized ship-borne invasion of the island by Cuban exiles at Playa Girón and Playa Larga in Santa Clara Province, a failure that publicly humiliated the United States. Castro responded by publicly embracing Marxism-Leninism, and the Soviet Union pledged to provide further support. In December, the U.S. government began a violent campaign of terrorist attacks against civilians in Cuba and covert operations and sabotage against the administration in an attempt to overthrow the Cuban government. Berlin Crisis of 1961. The Berlin Crisis of 1961 was the last major incident in the Cold War regarding the status of Berlin and post-World War II Germany. By the early 1950s, the Soviet approach to restricting immigration movement was emulated by most of the rest of the Eastern Bloc. However, hundreds of thousands of East Germans annually emigrated to free and prosperous West Germany through a loophole in the system that existed between East Berlin and West Berlin. The emigration resulted in a massive brain drain from East Germany to West Germany of younger educated professionals, such that nearly 20% of East Germany's population had migrated to West Germany by 1961. That June, the Soviet Union issued a new ultimatum demanding the withdrawal of Allied forces from West Berlin. The request was rebuffed, but the United States now limited its security guarantees to West Berlin. On 13 August, East Germany erected a barbed wire barrier that would eventually be expanded through construction into the Berlin Wall, effectively closing the loophole and preventing its citizens from fleeing to the west. Cuban Missile Crisis and Khrushchev's ousting. The Kennedy administration continued seeking ways to oust Castro following the Bay of Pigs invasion, experimenting with various ways of covertly facilitating the overthrow of the Cuban government. Significant hopes were pinned on the program of terrorist attacks and other destabilization operations known as Operation Mongoose, that was devised under the Kennedy administration in 1961. Khrushchev learned of the project in February 1962, and preparations to install Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba were undertaken in response. Alarmed, Kennedy considered various reactions. He ultimately responded to the installation of nuclear missiles in Cuba with a naval blockade, and he presented an ultimatum to the Soviets. Khrushchev backed down from a confrontation, and the Soviet Union removed the missiles in return for a public American pledge not to invade Cuba again, as well as a covert deal to remove U.S. missiles from Turkey. The Cuban Missile Crisis, October-November 1962, brought the world closer to nuclear war than ever before. The aftermath led to efforts in the nuclear arms race at nuclear disarmament and improving relations. Although the Cold War's first arms control agreement, the Antarctic Treaty, had come into force in 1961. The compromise embarrassed Khrushchev and the Soviet Union because the withdrawal of U.S. missiles from Italy and Turkey was a secret deal between Kennedy and Khrushchev, and the Soviets were seen as retreating from circumstances that they had started. In 1964, Khrushchev's Kremlin colleagues managed to oust him, but allowed him a peaceful retirement. He was accused of rudeness and incompetence, and John Lewis Gaddis argues that he was also blamed with ruining Soviet agriculture, bringing the world to the brink of nuclear war, and becoming an international embarrassment when he authorized construction of the Berlin Wall. According to Dobrynin, the top Soviet leadership took the Cuban outcome as a blow to its prestige, bordering on humiliation. From confrontation to détente, 1962-1979. In the course of the 1960s and 1970s, Cold War participants struggled to adjust to a new, more complicated pattern of international relations in which the world was no longer divided into two clearly opposed blocs. From the beginning of the post-war period with American help, Western Europe and Japan rapidly recovered from the destruction of World War II and sustained strong economic growth throughout the 1950s and 1960s, with per capita GDPs approaching those of the United States, while Eastern Bloc economies stagnated. In Indonesia, the hardline anti-communist General Suharto wrested control from predecessor Sukarno in an attempt to establish a new order. From 1965 to 1966, with the aid of the US and other Western governments, the military led the mass killing of more than 500,000 members and sympathizers of the Indonesian Communist Party and other leftist organizations, and detained hundreds of thousands in prison camps under inhumane conditions. A top-secret CIA report stated that the massacres rank as one of the worst mass murders of the 20th century, along with the Soviet purges of the 1930s, the Nazi mass murders during the Second World War, and the Maoist bloodbath of the early 1950s. These killings served U.S. interests and constitute a major turning point in the Cold War as the balance of power shifted in Southeast Asia. The Vietnam War descended into a quagmire for the United States, leading to a decline in international prestige and economic stability, derailing arms agreements and provoking domestic unrest. America's withdrawal from the war led it to embrace a policy of détente with both China and the Soviet Union. Backed by the Kampuchean United Front for National Salvation, an organization of Khmer, pro-Soviet communists, and Khmer Rouge defectors, Vietnam invaded Cambodia on 22 December 1978. The invasion succeeded in deposing Pol Pot, but the new state struggled to gain international recognition beyond the Soviet bloc sphere. Despite the international outcry at the Pol Pot regime's gross human rights violations, representatives of the Khmer Rouge were allowed to be seated in the UN General Assembly, with strong support from China, the Western powers, and the member countries of ASEAN. Following the destruction of the Khmer Rouge, the national reconstruction of Cambodia was hampered, and Vietnam suffered a punitive Chinese attack. Although unable to deter Vietnam from ousting Pol Pot, China demonstrated that its Cold War communist adversary, the Soviet Union, was unable to protect its Vietnamese ally. Former U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger wrote that China succeeded in exposing the limits of Soviet strategic reach, and speculated that the desire to compensate for their ineffectuality contributed to the Soviets' decision to intervene in Afghanistan a year later. In the 1973 oil crisis, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, cut their petroleum output. This raised oil prices and hurt Western economies, but helped the Soviet Union by generating a huge flow of money from its oil sales. As a result of the oil crisis, combined with the growing influence of Third World alignments, such as OPEC and the non-aligned movement, less powerful countries had more room to assert their independence and often showed themselves resistant to pressure from either superpower. Meanwhile, Moscow was forced to turn its attention inward to deal with the Soviet Union's deep-seated domestic economic problems. During this period, Soviet leaders such as Leonid Brezhnev and Alexei Kosygin embraced the notion of détente, Vietnam War. Under President John F. Kennedy, U.S. troop levels in Vietnam grew from just under 1,000 in 1959 to 16,000 in 1963. South Vietnamese President Ngo Dinh Diem's heavy-handed crackdown on Buddhist monks in 1963 led the U.S. to endorse a deadly military coup against Diem. The war escalated further in 1964, following the controversial Gulf of Tonkin incident, in which a U.S. destroyer was alleged to have clashed with North Vietnamese fast attack craft. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution gave President Lyndon B. Johnson broad authorization to increase U.S. military presence, deploying ground combat units for the first time and increasing troop levels to 184,000. Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev responded by reversing Khrushchev's policy of disengagement and increasing aid to the North Vietnamese, hoping to entice the North from its pro-Chinese position. The USSR discouraged further escalation of the war, however, providing just enough military assistance to tie up American forces. From this point, the People's Army of Vietnam, PAVN, engaged in more conventional warfare with U.S. and South Vietnamese forces. The Tet Offensive of 1968 proved to be the turning point of the war. Despite years of American tutelage and aid, the South Vietnamese forces were unable to withstand the communist offensive, and the task fell to U.S. forces instead. At the same time, in 1963-1965, American domestic politics saw the triumph of liberalism. According to historian Joseph Crespino, it has become a staple of 20th century historiography that Cold War concerns were at the root of a number of progressive political accomplishments in the post-war period. A high, progressive marginal tax rate that helped fund the arms race and contributed to broad income equality, bipartisan support for far-reaching civil rights legislation that transformed politics and society in the American South, which had long given the lie to America's egalitarian ethos. Bipartisan support for overturning an explicitly racist immigration system that had been in place since the 1920s. And free healthcare for the elderly and the poor, a partial fulfillment of one of the unaccomplished goals of the New Deal era. The list could go on: nuclear testing and use of outer space treaties. The Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was signed on August 5, 1963, by the United States, the Soviet Union, and over 100 other nations. This treaty banned nuclear weapons tests in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater, restricting such tests to underground environments. The treaty followed heightened concerns over the militarization of space, amplified by the United States Starfish Prime test in 1962, which involved the detonation of a nuclear device in the upper atmosphere. To further delineate the peaceful use of outer space, the United Nations facilitated the drafting of the Treaty on Principles governing the activities of states in the exploration and use of outer space, including the Moon and other celestial bodies, commonly known as the Outer Space Treaty. Signed on January 27, 1967, by the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom, it entered into force on October 10, 1967. The treaty established space as a domain to be used exclusively for peaceful purposes, prohibiting the placement of nuclear weapons or any other weapons of mass destruction in orbit or on celestial bodies. Invasion of Czechoslovakia. In 1968, a period of political liberalization took place in Czechoslovakia called the Prague Spring. An action program of reforms included increasing freedom of the press, freedom of speech, and freedom of movement, along with an economic emphasis on consumer goods, the possibility of a multi-party government, limitations on the power of the secret police, and potential withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact. In answer to the Prague Spring, on 20th August 1968, the Soviet Army, together with most of their Warsaw Pact allies, invaded Czechoslovakia. The invasion was followed by a wave of emigration, including an estimated 70,000 Czechs and Slovaks initially fleeing, with the total eventually reaching 300,000. The invasion sparked intense protests from Yugoslavia, Romania, China, and from Western European countries. Sino-Soviet split and Nixon-China visit. As a result of the Sino-Soviet split, tensions along the Chinese-Soviet border reached their peak in 1969, when the Soviet planned to launch a large-scale nuclear strike against China. United States President Richard Nixon intervened and decided to use the conflict to shift the balance of power towards the West in the Cold War through a policy of rapprochement with China, which began with his 1972 visit to China and culminated in 1979 with the signing of the joint communique on the establishment of diplomatic relations by President Carter and Chinese Communist Party leader Deng Xiaoping, Nixon, Brezhnev, and détente. Although indirect conflict between Cold War powers continued through the late 1960s and early 1970s, tensions were beginning to ease. Following the ousting of Khrushchev, another period of collective leadership ensued, consisting of Leonid Brezhnev as General Secretary, Alexei Kosygin as Premier, and Nikolai Podgorny as Chairman of the Presidium, lasting until Brezhnev established himself in the early 1970s as the preeminent Soviet leader. Following his visit to China, Nixon met with Soviet leaders in Moscow. These strategic arms limitation talks resulted in landmark arms control treaties. These aimed to limit the development of costly anti-ballistic missiles and nuclear missiles. Nixon and Brezhnev proclaimed a new era of peaceful coexistence and established the groundbreaking new policy of détente, or cooperation, between the superpowers. Meanwhile, Brezhnev attempted to revive the Soviet economy, which was declining in part because of heavy military expenditures. The Soviet Union's military budget in the 1970s was massive, 40–60% of the federal budget and 15% of GDP. Between 1972 and 1974, the two sides also agreed to strengthen their economic ties, including agreements for increased trade. As a result of their meetings, détente would replace the hostility of the Cold War, and the two countries would live mutually. These developments coincided with Bonn's Ostpolitik policy, formulated by the West German Chancellor Willy Brandt, an effort to normalize relations between West Germany and Eastern Europe. Other agreements were concluded to stabilize the situation in Europe, culminating in the Helsinki Accords, signed at the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe in 1975. The Helsinki Accords, in which the Soviets promised to grant free elections in Europe, has been called a major concession to ensure peace by the Soviets. In practice, the Soviet government significantly curbed the rule of law, civil liberties, protection of law, and guarantees of property, which were considered examples of bourgeois morality by Soviet legal theorists such as Andrei Vyshinsky. The Soviet Union signed legally binding human rights documents, such as the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights in 1973 and the Helsinki Accords in 1975, but they were neither widely known or accessible to people living under communist rule, nor were they taken seriously by the communist authorities. Human rights activists in the Soviet Union were regularly subjected to harassment, repressions, and arrests. The pro-Soviet American business magnate Armand Hammer of Occidental Petroleum often mediated trade relations. Author Daniel Yergin, in his book The Prize, writes that Hammer ended up as a go-between for 5 Soviet general secretaries and 7 U.S. presidents. Hammer had extensive business relationship in the Soviet Union, stretching back to the 1920s with Lenin's approval. According to Christian Science Monitor in 1980, although his business dealings with the Soviet Union were cut short when Stalin came to power, he had more or less single-handedly laid the groundwork for the 1980 state of Western trade with the Soviet Union. Kissinger and Nixon were realists, who de-emphasized idealistic goals like anti-communism or promotion of democracy worldwide because those goals were too expensive in terms of America's economic capabilities. They rejected idealism as impractical and too expensive, and neither man showed much sensitivity to the plight of people living under communism. Kissinger's realism fell out of fashion as idealism returned to American foreign policy, with Carter's moralism emphasizing human rights, and Reagan's rollback strategy aimed at destroying communism. Late 1970s deterioration of relations. In the 1970s, the KGB, led by Yuri Andropov, continued to persecute distinguished Soviet dissidents, such as Alexander Solzhenitsyn and Andrei Sakharov, who were criticizing the Soviet leadership in harsh terms. Indirect conflict between the superpowers continued through this period of détente in the Third World, particularly during political crises in the Middle East, Chile, Ethiopia, and Angola. In 1973, Nixon announced his administration was committed to seeking most favored nation trade status with the USSR, which was challenged by Congress in the Jackson-Vanik Amendment. The United States had long linked trade with the Soviet Union to its foreign policy toward the Soviet Union, and especially since the early 1980s to Soviet human rights policies. The Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which was attached to the 1974 Trade Act, linked the granting of most favored nation to the USSR to the right of persecuted Soviet Jews to emigrate. Because the Soviet Union refused the right of emigration to Jewish refuseniks, the ability of the president to apply most favored nation trade status to the Soviet Union was restricted. Although President Jimmy Carter tried to place another limit on the arms race with a SALT II agreement in 1979, his efforts were undermined by the other events that year, including the Iranian Revolution and the Nicaraguan Revolution, which both ousted pro-US governments, and his retaliation against the Soviet coup in Afghanistan in December. Renewal of tensions, 1979-1985. The period in the late 1970s and early 1980s showed an intensive reawakening of Cold War tensions and conflicts. Tensions greatly increased between the major powers, with both sides becoming more militant. Diggins says, Reagan went all out to fight the Second Cold War by supporting counterinsurgencies in the Third World. Cox says, the intensity of this Second Cold War was as great as its duration was short: Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and end of détente. In April 1978, the Communist People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, PDPA, seized power in Afghanistan in the Sour Revolution. Within months, opponents of the communist regime launched an uprising in eastern Afghanistan that quickly expanded into a civil war waged by guerrilla mujahideen against government forces countrywide. The Islamic Unity of Afghanistan. Mujahideen insurgents received military training and weapons in neighboring Pakistan and China, while the Soviet Union sent thousands of military advisors to support the PDPA government. Meanwhile, increasing friction between the competing factions of the PDPA, the dominant Khalq and the more moderate Parcham, resulted in the dismissal of Parchami cabinet members and the arrest of Parchami military officers under the pretext of a Parchami coup. By mid-1979, the United States had started a covert program to assist the Mujahideen. In September 1979, Khalqist President Nur Muhammad Taraki was assassinated in a coup within the PDPA, orchestrated by fellow Khalq member Hafizullah Amin, who assumed the presidency. Distrusted by the Soviets, Amin was assassinated by Soviet special forces during Operation Storm 333 in December 1979. Afghan forces suffered losses during the Soviet operation. 30 Afghan palace guards and over 300 army guards were killed, while another 150 were captured. In the aftermath of the operation, a total of 1,700 Afghan soldiers who surrendered to Soviet forces were taken as prisoners, and the Soviets installed Babrak Karmal, the leader of the PDPA's Parcham faction, as Amin's successor. Veterans of the Soviet Union's Alpha Group have stated that Operation Storm 333 was one of the most successful in the unit's history. Documents released following the dissolution of the Soviet Union in the 1990s revealed that the Soviet leadership believed Amin had secret contacts within the American embassy in Kabul and was capable of reaching an agreement with the United States. However, allegations of Amin colluding with the Americans have been widely discredited. The PDPA was tasked to fill the vacuum and carried out a purge of Amin supporters. Soviet troops were deployed to put Afghanistan under Soviet control, with Karmal in more substantial numbers, although the Soviet government did not expect to do most of the fighting in Afghanistan. As a result, however, the Soviets were now directly involved in what had been a domestic war in Afghanistan. Carter responded to the Soviet invasion by withdrawing the SALT II treaty from ratification, imposing embargoes on grain and technology shipments to the USSR, and demanding a significant increase in military spending, and further announced the boycott of the 1980 Summer Olympics in Moscow, which was joined by 65 other nations. He described the Soviet incursion as the most serious threat to the peace since the Second World War. Reagan and Thatcher. In January 1977, 4 years prior to becoming president, Ronald Reagan bluntly stated in a conversation with Richard V, "Alan, his basic expectation in relation to the Cold War? My idea of American policy toward the Soviet Union is simple, and some would say simplistic," he said. "It is this: we win and they lose." In 1980, Ronald Reagan won the 1980 presidential election, vowing to increase military spending and confront the Soviets everywhere. Both Reagan and new British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher denounced the Soviet Union and its ideology. Reagan labeled the Soviet Union an evil empire and predicted that communism would be left on the ash heap of history, while Thatcher inculpated the Soviets as bent on world dominance. In 1982, Reagan tried to cut off Moscow's access to hard currency by impeding its proposed gas line to Western Europe. It hurt the Soviet economy, but it also caused ill will among American allies in Europe who counted on that revenue. Reagan retreated on this issue. By early 1985, Reagan's anti-communist position had developed into a stance known as the New Reagan Doctrine, which, in addition to containment, formulated an additional right to subvert existing communist governments. Besides continuing Carter's policy of supporting the Islamic opponents of the Soviet Union and the Soviet-backed PDPA government in Afghanistan, the CIA also sought to weaken the Soviet Union itself by promoting Islamism in the majority Muslim Central Asian Soviet Union. Additionally, the CIA encouraged anti-communist Pakistan's ISI to train Muslims from around the world to participate in the jihad against the Soviet Union, Polish Solidarity Movement, and martial law. Pope John Paul II provided a moral focus for anti-communism. A visit to his native Poland in 1979 stimulated a religious and nationalist resurgence centered on the Solidarity Movement trade union that galvanized opposition and may have led to his attempted assassination 2 years later. In December 1981, Poland's Wojciech Jaruzelski reacted to the crisis by imposing a period of martial law. Reagan imposed economic sanctions on Poland in response. Mikhail Suslov, the Kremlin's top ideologist, advised Soviet leaders not to intervene if Poland fell under the control of Solidarity, for fear it might lead to heavy economic sanctions, resulting in a catastrophe for the Soviet economy, US and USSR military and economic issues. The Soviet Union had built up a military that consumed as much as 25% of its gross national product at the expense of consumer goods and investment in civilian sectors. Soviet spending on the arms race and other Cold War commitments both caused and exacerbated deep-seated structural problems in the Soviet system, which experienced at least a decade of economic stagnation during the late Brezhnev years. Soviet investment in the defense sector was not driven by military necessity, but in large part by the interests of the nomenklatura, which was dependent on the sector for their own power and privileges. The Soviet armed forces became the largest in the world in terms of the numbers and types of weapons they possessed, in the number of troops in their ranks, and in the sheer size of their military-industrial base. However, the quantitative advantages held by the Soviet military often concealed areas where the Eastern Bloc dramatically lagged behind the West. For example, the Persian Gulf War demonstrated how the armor, fire control systems, and firing range of the Soviet Union's most common main battle tank, the T-72, were drastically inferior to the American M1 Abrams, yet the USSR fielded almost 3 times as many T-72s as the US deployed M1s. By the early 1980s, the USSR had built up a military arsenal, an army surpassing that of the United States. Soon after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, President Carter began massively building up the United States military. This buildup was accelerated by the Reagan administration, which increased the military spending from 5.3% of GNP in 1981 to 6.5% in 1986, the largest peacetime defense buildup in United States history. The American-Soviet tensions present during 1983 was defined by some as the start of Cold War II. While in retrospective this phase of the Cold War was generally defined as a war of words, the Soviets' peace offensive was largely rejected by the West. Tensions continued to intensify as Reagan revived the B-1 Lancer program, which had been canceled by the Carter administration, produced LGM-118 Peacekeeper missiles, installed U.S. cruise missiles in Europe, and announced the experimental Strategic Defense Initiative, dubbed Star Wars by the media, a defense program to shoot down missiles in mid-flight. The Soviets deployed RSD-10 Pioneer ballistic missiles targeting Western Europe, and NATO decided, under the impetus of the Carter presidency, to deploy MGM-31 Pershing and cruise missiles in Europe, primarily West Germany. This deployment placed missiles just 10 minutes striking distance from Moscow. After Reagan's military buildup, the Soviet Union did not respond by further building its military because the enormous military expenses, along with inefficient planned manufacturing and collectivized agriculture, were already a heavy burden for the Soviet economy. At the same time, Saudi Arabia increased oil production, even as other non-OPEC nations were increasing production. These developments contributed to the 1980s oil glut, which affected the Soviet Union as oil was the main source of Soviet export revenues. Issues with command economics, oil price decreases, and large military expenditures gradually brought the Soviet economy to stagnation. On 1 September 1983, the Soviet Union shot down Korean Airlines Flight Grozny 7, a Boeing 747 with 269 people aboard, including sitting Congressman Larry McDonald, an action which Reagan characterized as a massacre. The airliner was en route from Anchorage to Seoul, but owing to a navigational mistake made by the crew, it flew through Russian prohibited airspace. The Soviet Air Force treated the unidentified aircraft as an intruding U.S. spy plane and destroyed it with air-to-air missiles. The incident increased support for military deployment, overseen by Reagan, which stood in place until the later accords between Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev. During the early hours of 26 September 1983, the 1983 Soviet nuclear false alarm incident occurred. Systems in Serpukhov 15 underwent a glitch that claimed several intercontinental ballistic missiles were heading towards Russia, but Officer Stanislav Petrov correctly suspected it was a false alarm, ensuring the Soviets did not respond to the non-existent attack. As such, he has been credited as the man who saved the world. The Able Archer 83 exercise in November 1983, a realistic simulation of a coordinated NATO nuclear release, was perhaps the most dangerous moment since the Cuban Missile Crisis, as the Soviet leadership feared that a nuclear attack might be imminent. American domestic public concerns about intervening in foreign conflicts persisted from the end of the Vietnam War. The Reagan administration emphasized the use of quick, low-cost counterinsurgency tactics to intervene in foreign conflicts. In 1983, the Reagan administration intervened in the multi-sided Lebanese Civil War, invaded Grenada, bombed Libya, and backed the Central American Contras, anti-communist paramilitaries seeking to overthrow the Soviet-aligned Sandinista government in Nicaragua. While Reagan's interventions against Grenada and Libya were popular in the United States, his backing of the Contra rebels was mired in controversy. The Reagan administration's backing of the military government of Guatemala during the Guatemalan Civil War, in particular the regime of Efraín Ríos Montt, was also controversial. Meanwhile, the Soviets incurred high costs for their own foreign interventions, although Brezhnev was convinced in 1979 that the Soviet war in Afghanistan would be brief. Muslim guerrillas, aided by the US, China, Britain, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan, waged a fierce resistance against the invasion. The Kremlin sent nearly 100,000 troops to support its puppet regime in Afghanistan, leading many outside observers to dub the war the Soviets' Vietnam. However, Moscow's quagmire in Afghanistan was far more disastrous for the Soviets than Vietnam had been for the Americans because the conflict coincided with a period of internal decay and domestic crisis in the Soviet system. A senior U.S. State Department official predicted such an outcome as early as 1980, positing that the invasion resulted in part from a domestic crisis within the Soviet system. It may be that the thermodynamic law of entropy has caught up with the Soviet system, which now seems to expend more energy on simply maintaining its equilibrium than on improving itself. We could be seeing a period of foreign movement at a time of internal decay. Final years, 1985-1991. Gorbachev's reforms. By the time the comparatively youthful Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary in 1985, the Soviet economy was stagnant and faced a sharp fall in foreign currency earnings as a result of the downward slide in oil prices in the 1980s. These issues prompted Gorbachev to investigate measures to revive the ailing state. An ineffectual start led to the conclusion that deeper structural changes were necessary, and in June 1987, Gorbachev announced an agenda of economic reform called perestroika, or restructuring. Perestroika relaxed the production quota system, allowed cooperative ownership of small businesses, and paved the way for foreign investment. These measures were intended to redirect the country's resources from costly Cold War military commitments to more productive areas in the civilian sector. Despite initial skepticism in the West, the new Soviet leader proved to be committed to reversing the Soviet Union's deteriorating economic condition instead of continuing the arms race with the West, partly as a way to fight off internal opposition from party cliques to his reforms. Gorbachev simultaneously introduced glasnost, or openness, which increased freedom of the press and the transparency of state institutions. Glasnost was intended to reduce the corruption at the top of the Communist Party and moderate the abuse of power in the Central Committee. Glasnost also enabled increased contact between Soviet citizens and the Western world, particularly with the United States, contributing to the accelerating détente between the two nations. Thaw in relations. In response to the Kremlin's military and political concessions, Reagan agreed to renew talks on economic issues and the scaling back of the arms race. The first summit was held in November 1985 in Geneva, Switzerland. A second summit was held in October 1986 in Reykjavik, Iceland. Talks went well until the focus shifted to Reagan's proposed Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, which Gorbachev wanted to be eliminated. Reagan refused. The negotiations failed, but the third summit, Washington Summit, 1987, 8 to 10th December 1987, led to a breakthrough with the signing of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, INF. The INF Treaty eliminated all nuclear-armed, ground-launched ballistic and cruise missiles, with ranges between 500 and 5,500 kilometers, 310 and 3,420 miles, and their infrastructure. During 1988, it became apparent to the Soviets that oil and gas subsidies, along with the cost of maintaining massive troops levels, represented a substantial economic drain. In addition, the security advantage of a buffer zone was recognized as irrelevant, and the Soviets officially declared that they would no longer intervene in the affairs of satellite states in Central and Eastern Europe. George H.W. Bush and Gorbachev met at the Moscow Summit in May 1988 and the Governors' Island Summit in December 1988. In 1989, Soviet forces withdrew from Afghanistan without achieving their objectives. Later that year, the Berlin Wall, the inner German border, and the Iron Curtain fell. On 3 December 1989, Gorbachev and Bush declared the Cold War over at the Malta Summit. In February 1990, Gorbachev agreed with the U.S. proposed treaty on the final settlement with respect to Germany and signed it on 12th September 1990, paving the way for the German reunification. When the Berlin Wall came down, Gorbachev's Common European Home concept began to take shape. The two former adversaries were partners in the Gulf War against Iraq, August 1990, February 1991. During the final summit in Moscow in July 1991, Gorbachev and Bush signed the START One Arms Control Treaty. Eastern Europe breaks away. Two developments dominated the decade that followed: the increasingly apparent crumbling of the Soviet Union's economic and political structures, and the patchwork attempts at reforms to reverse that process. Kenneth S. Defies argued in Beyond Oil that the Reagan administration encouraged Saudi Arabia to lower the price of oil to the point where the Soviets could not make a profit selling their oil, and resulted in the depletion of the country's hard currency reserves. Brezhnev's next two successors, transitional figures with deep roots in his tradition, did not last long. Yuri Andropov was 68 years old and Konstantin Chernenko, 72, when they assumed power. Both died in less than 2 years. In an attempt to avoid a third short-lived leader, in 1985, the Soviets turned to the next generation and selected Mikhail Gorbachev. He made significant changes in the economy and party leadership, called perestroika. His policy of glasnost freed public access to information after decades of heavy government censorship. Gorbachev also moved to end the Cold War. In 1988, the USSR abandoned its war in Afghanistan and began to withdraw its forces. In the following year, Gorbachev refused to interfere in the internal affairs of the Soviet satellite states, which paved the way for the revolutions of 1989. In particular, the standstill of the Soviet Union at the Pan-European picnic in August 1989, then set a peaceful chain reaction in motion, at the end of which the Eastern Bloc collapsed. With the tearing down of the Berlin Wall, and with East and West Germany pursuing reunification, the Iron Curtain between the West and Soviet-occupied regions came down. By 1989, the Soviet alliance system was on the brink of collapse, and deprived of Soviet military support, the communist leaders of the Warsaw Pact states were losing power. Grassroots organizations, such as Poland's Solidarity movement, rapidly gained ground with strong popular bases. The Pan-European picnic in August 1989 in Hungary finally started a peaceful movement that the rulers in the Eastern Bloc could not stop. It was the largest movement of refugees from East Germany since the Berlin Wall was built in 1961, and ultimately brought about the fall of the Iron Curtain. The patrons of the picnic, Otto von Habsburg and the Hungarian Minister of State, Imre Pozsgai, saw the planned event as an opportunity to test Mikhail Gorbachev's reaction. The Austrian branch of the Pan-European Union, which was then headed by Otto von Habsburg, distributed thousands of brochures inviting the GDR holidaymakers in Hungary to a picnic near the border at Sopron. But with the mass exodus at the Pan-European picnic, the subsequent hesitant behavior of the ruling Socialist Unity Party of East Germany and the non-interference of the Soviet Union broke the dams. Now tens of thousands of media-informed East Germans made their way to Hungary, which was no longer willing to keep its borders completely closed or to oblige its border troops to use armed force. On the one hand, this caused disagreement among the Eastern European states, and on the other hand, it was clear to the Eastern European population that the governments no longer had absolute power. In 1989, the communist governments in Poland and Hungary became the first to negotiate the organization of competitive elections. In Czechoslovakia and East Germany, mass protests unseated entrenched communist leaders. The communist regimes in Bulgaria and Romania also crumbled, in the latter case as the result of a violent uprising. Attitudes had changed enough that U.S. Secretary of State James Baker suggested that the American government would not be opposed to Soviet intervention in Romania on behalf of the opposition to prevent bloodshed. The tidal wave of change culminated with the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989, which symbolized the collapse of European communist governments and graphically ended the Iron Curtain divide of Europe. The 1989 revolutionary wave swept across Central and Eastern Europe and peacefully overthrew all of the Soviet-style Marxist-Leninist states: East Germany, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Bulgaria. Romania was the only Eastern Bloc country to topple its communist regime violently and execute its head of state, Soviet dissolution. At the same time, the Soviet republics started legal moves towards potentially declaring sovereignty over their territories, citing the freedom to secede in Article 72 of the USSR Constitution. On 7th April 1990, a law was passed allowing a republic to secede if more than 2/3 of its residents voted for it in a referendum. Many held their first free elections in the Soviet era for their own national legislatures in 1990. Many of these legislatures proceeded to produce legislation contradicting the Union laws in what was known as the War of Laws. In 1989, the Russian SFSR convened a newly elected Congress of People's Deputies. Boris Yeltsin was elected its chairman. On 12th of June 1990, the Congress declared Russia's sovereignty over its territory and proceeded to pass laws that attempted to supersede some of the Soviet laws. After a landslide victory of Son Judas in Lithuania, that country declared its independence restored on 11th of March 1990, citing the illegality of the Soviet occupation of the Baltic states. Soviet forces attempted to halt the secession by crushing popular demonstrations in Lithuania, Bloody Sunday, and Latvia, the barricades. As a result, numerous civilians were killed or wounded. However, these actions only bolstered international support for the secessionists. A referendum for the preservation of the USSR was held on 17th of March 1991 in 9 republics, the remainder having boycotted the vote, with the majority of the population in those republics voting for preservation of the Union in the form of a new federation. The referendum gave Gorbachev a minor boost. In the summer of 1991, the new Union Treaty, which would have turned the country into a much looser union, was agreed upon by 8 republics. The signing of the treaty, however, was interrupted by the August coup, an attempted coup d'etat by hardline members of the government and the KGB who sought to reverse Gorbachev's reforms and reassert the central government's control over the republics. After the coup collapsed, Russian President Yeltsin was seen as a hero for his decisive actions, while Gorbachev's power was effectively ended. The balance of power tipped significantly towards the republics. In August 1991, Latvia and Estonia immediately declared the restoration of their full independence, following Lithuania's 1990 example. Gorbachev resigned as General Secretary in late August, and soon afterwards, the party's activities were indefinitely suspended, effectively ending its rule. By the fall, Gorbachev could no longer influence events outside Moscow, and he was being challenged even there by Yeltsin, who had been elected president of Russia in July 1991. Later in August, Gorbachev resigned as General Secretary of the Communist Party, and Russian President Boris Yeltsin ordered the seizure of Soviet property. Gorbachev clung to power as the president of the Soviet Union until 25 December 1991, when the USSR dissolved. 15 states emerged from the Soviet Union, with by far the largest and most populous one, which also was the founder of the Soviet state, with the October Revolution in Petrograd, the Russian Federation, taking full responsibility for all the rights and obligations of the USSR under the Charter of the United Nations, including the financial obligations. As such, Russia assumed the Soviet Union's UN membership and permanent membership on the Security Council, nuclear stockpile, and the control over the armed forces. In his 1992 State of the Union address, U.S. President George H.W. Bush expressed his emotions. "The biggest thing that has happened in the world, in my life, in our lives, is this. By the grace of God, America won the Cold War." Bush and Yeltsin met in February 1992, declaring a new era of friendship and partnership. In January 1993, Bush and Yeltsin agreed to START II, which provided for further nuclear arms reductions on top of the original START treaty. Aftermath. In summing up the international ramifications of these events, Vladislav Zubok stated, "The collapse of the Soviet Empire was an event of epochal geopolitical, military, ideological, and economic significance. After the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Russia drastically cut military spending, and restructuring the economy left millions unemployed. According to Western analysis, the neoliberal reforms in Russia culminated in a recession in the early 1990s, more severe than the Great Depression, as experienced by the United States and Germany. Western analysts suggest that in the 25 years following the end of the Cold War, only 5 or 6 of the post-communist states are on a path to joining the rich and capitalist world, while most are falling behind, some to such an extent that it will take several decades to catch up to where they were before the collapse of communism. Decommunization. Stephen Holmes of the University of Chicago argued in 1996 that decommunization, after a brief, active period, quickly ended in near universal failure. After the introduction of lustration, demand for scapegoats has become relatively low, and former communists have been elected for high governmental and other administrative positions. Holmes notes that the only real exception was former East Germany, where thousands of former Stasi informers have been fired from public positions. Holmes suggests the following reasons for the failure of decommunization. After 45 to 70 years of communist rule, nearly every family has members associated with the state. After the initial desire to root out the Reds, came a realization that massive punishment is wrong, and finding only some guilty is hardly justice. The urgency of the current economic problems of post-communism makes the crimes of the communist past old news for many citizens. Decommunization is believed to be a power game of elites. The difficulty of dislodging the social elite makes it require a totalitarian state to disenfranchise the enemies of the people quickly and efficiently, and a desire for normalcy overcomes the desire for punitive justice. Very few people have a perfectly clean slate, and so are available to fill the positions that require significant expertise. Compared with the decommunization efforts of the other former constituents of the Eastern Bloc and the Soviet Union, decommunization in Russia has been restricted to half measures, if conducted at all. Notable anti-communist measures in the Russian Federation include the banning of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and the creation of the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, as well as changing the names of some Russian cities back to what they were before the 1917 October Revolution: Leningrad to St. Petersburg, Sverdlovsk to Yekaterinburg, and Gorky to Nizhny Novgorod, though others were maintained, with Ulyanovsk, former Simbirsk, Tolyatti, former Stavropol, and Kirov, former Vyatka, being examples. Even though Leningrad and Sverdlovsk were renamed, regions that were named after them are still officially called Leningrad and Sverdlovsk oblasts. Nostalgia for the Soviet Union is gradually on the rise in Russia. Communist symbols continue to form an important part of the rhetoric used in state-controlled media, as banning on them in other countries is seen by the Russian Foreign Ministry as sacrilege and a perverse idea of good and evil. The process of decommunization in Ukraine, a neighboring post-Soviet state, was met with fierce criticism by Russia. The state anthem of the Russian Federation, adopted in 2000, the same year Vladimir Putin began his first term as president of Russia, uses the exact same music as the state anthem of the Soviet Union, but with new lyrics written by Sergei Mikhalkov. Conversely, decommunization in Ukraine started during and after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. With the success of the Revolution of Dignity in 2014, the Ukrainian government approved laws that outlawed communist symbols. In July 2015, President of Ukraine Petro Poroshenko signed a set of laws that started a 6-month period for the removal of communist monuments, excluding World War II monuments, and renaming of public places named after communist-related themes. At the time, this meant that 22 cities and 44 villages were set to get new names. In 2016, 51,493 streets in 987 cities and villages were renamed, and 1,320 Lenin monuments and 1,069 monuments to other communist figures removed. Violation of the law carries a penalty of a potential media ban and prison sentences of up to 5 years. The Ministry of the Interior stripped the Communist Party of Ukraine, the Communist Party of Ukraine, renewed. in the Communist Party of Workers and Peasants of their right to participate in elections, and stated it was continuing the court actions that started in July 2014 to end the registration of communist parties in Ukraine. By 16th of December 2015, these three parties had been banned in Ukraine. The Communist Party of Ukraine appealed the ban to the European Court of Human Rights. Collapse of Yugoslavia and Balkan conflicts. The Cold War had provided external stabilizing pressures. Both the United States and the Soviet Union had a vested interest in Yugoslavia's stability, ensuring it remained a buffer state in the East-West divide. This resulted in financial and political support for its regime. When the Cold War ended, this external support evaporated, leaving Yugoslavia more vulnerable to internal divisions. As Yugoslavia fragmented, the wars began after Slovenia and Croatia declared independence in 1991. Serbia, under Slobodan Milosevic, opposed these moves. The Bosnian War, 1992-1995, was the most brutal of the Yugoslav wars, characterized by ethnic cleansing and genocide. International organizations, including the United Nations, struggled to manage the violence. NATO eventually intervened with airstrikes in Bosnia, 1995, as part of Operation Deliberate Force, and later in Kosovo, 1999, as part of Operation Allied Force. These interventions marked the transition of NATO as a deterrent to the Soviet Union, to also functioning at the time as an active peacekeeping and conflict resolution force. Influence. The post-Cold War world is considered to be unipolar, with the United States the sole remaining superpower. The Cold War defined the political role of the United States after World War II. By 1989, the United States had military alliances with 50 countries, with 526,000 troops stationed abroad, with 326,000 in Europe, 2/3 of which were in West Germany, and 130,000 in Asia, mainly Japan and South Korea. The Cold War also marked the zenith of peacetime military-industrial complexes and large-scale military funding of science. Cumulative U.S. military expenditures throughout the entire Cold War amounted to an estimated $8 trillion. Nearly 100,000 Americans died in the Korean and Vietnam Wars. Although Soviet casualties are difficult to estimate as a share of gross national product, the financial cost for the Soviet Union was much higher than that incurred by the United States. Millions died in the superpowers' proxy wars around the globe, most notably in Eastern Asia. Most of the proxy wars and subsidies for local conflicts ended along with the Cold War. Interstate wars, ethnic wars, revolutionary wars, as well as refugee and displaced persons. Crises have declined sharply in the post-Cold War years. The aftermath of the Cold War is, however, not considered to be concluded. Many of the economic and social tensions that were exploited to fuel Cold War competition in parts of the Third World remain acute. The breakdown of state control in a number of areas formerly ruled by communist governments produced new civil and ethnic conflicts, particularly in the former Yugoslavia. In Central and Eastern Europe, the end of the Cold War has ushered in an era of economic growth and an increase in the number of liberal democracies, while in other parts of the world, such as Afghanistan, independence was accompanied by state failure. It has been posited by several scholars that the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the end of communism as a global force in the post-Cold War era allowed neoliberal capitalism to become the dominant global system, which has resulted in rising economic inequality. In popular culture, the Cold War endures as a popular topic reflected in entertainment media and continuing to the present with Cold War-themed feature films, novels, television, and web series, and other media. Historiography. Interpreting the course and origins of the conflict has been a source of heated controversy among historians, political scientists, and journalists. In particular, Historians have sharply disagreed as to who was responsible for the breakdown of Soviet-US relations after the Second World War, and whether the conflict between the two superpowers was inevitable or could have been avoided. Historians have also disagreed on what exactly the Cold War was, what the sources of the conflict were, and how to disentangle patterns of action and reaction between the two sides. Although explanations of the origins of the conflict in academic discussions are complex and diverse, several general schools of thought on the subject can be identified. Historians commonly speak of three different approaches to the study of the Cold War: orthodox accounts, revisionism, and post-revisionism. Orthodox accounts place responsibility for the Cold War on the Soviet Union and its expansion further into Europe. Revisionist writers place more responsibility for the breakdown of post-war peace on the United States, citing a range of U.S. efforts to isolate and confront the Soviet Union well before the end of World War II. Post-revisionists see the events of the Cold War as more nuanced and attempt to be more balanced in determining what occurred during the Cold War. Much of the historiography on the Cold War weaves together two or even all three of these broad categories. That's the complete article. If you made it this far, you'll love the rest of the channel. Subscribe for a new Wikipedia deep dive every single day. The next video is on screen now, and if there's a topic you want narrated, drop it in the comments. Thanks for watching.